All right, so we're going to dig through auditing your ROI today. I am Andy Carone. I'm the head of MarTech Consulting at Revenue Pulse, one of the leaders here at the Chicago MUG, and I'll be presenting on this today. I like to keep things pretty informal. So as we're running through, if there's anything that you have a specific question about that you really want to dig into initially before you kind of lose the context, feel free to hand raise. Also have a chance for questions at the end. And if you're a chatter instead of a hand raiser speaker, feel free to throw some questions in chat as well. I'll be monitoring that as I can during the presentation. So we're going to start out with level setting on ROI. Then we're going to talk about auditing Marketo and CRM specifically. We're going to talk about Salesforce today since that's the primary CRM most are using. And it's frankly fairly difficult without some fancy footwork to get a lot of the Marketo program data in against campaigns on things like dynamics, since the objects there are differently aligned. And then finally, we're going to look at auditing attribution tools. All right, so let's dig in on level setting ROI. So this is pretty basic, but I want to really start at a basic place and then build up to something a little bit more complex. So obviously, when we talk about ROI, we're talking about return on investment. Oops, this is interesting. And when we talk about return on investment, what we're talking about are obviously closed-won deals. These typically live on CRM opportunities, marketing engagements that are driving eventually to that down funnel revenue, and then your marketing spend, your ad platforms, other areas where you're spending to promote the brand or get engagement. Done. Okay. So when we talk about return on investment, it's return divided by investment. This is going to give us our ROI. So for every dollar that we spent, we made $10. That would be essentially the breakdown here. That would be a great ROI. Most people are looking at a 201 to ROI, maybe a 3 or 4 to 1 ROI. Sometimes you see really big numbers in there, but those are very robust and mature teams typically. So when you're starting out, don't be deterred if the ROI that you're seeing doesn't look like some of the numbers we're going to look at today. I think that's the first thing I want to definitely point out. So we're also going to be thinking about ROI calculation today from several different perspectives. So we're going to think about it from a brand perspective across all channels. How much are we spending, and what's the marketing touched revenue that's the output of that? We're going to talk about that from a channel perspective, so breaking it down a little bit more, and then also sub-channel. And I think it's really important to have kind of this macro, micro, and middle ground view when we're talking about ROI, because a lot of times something will look good or bad from a top level, and when you drill down, you really start to separate the wheat from the chaff, but it's all part of a larger perspective. So these are several things to be thinking about as you're moving forward in building out your ROI engine. So attribution and calculating for ROI is really a journey. A lot of people start out simply by describing impact. We're looking at basic reporting, specific single campaign reporting, sort of level setting on how we measure, what we measure, what does that data mean, and what does it impact. When you're able to move from describing impact to defining impact, this is around the time that you start to get more into actual ROI. So, you know, if we're putting X amount of dollars in channel Y, will we hit our target? Will we not? From there, we move into forecasting, prediction, and then finally determining impact is being able to say, if I pull lever X, Y, Z, then this is the expected output that I anticipate seeing from that. So the evolution of ROI really starts, I think, in organizations with early campaign analysis. And a lot of organizations start out by looking at cost per lead or CPL. And the idea here is we want to know how many leads we drove from each of these sub-channels, and we want to know what the cost was around driving these. I think a lot of organizations, when they're at this really early stage, are concerned about the cost and not necessarily the output. And this is why ROI is such an important conversation to have, because as we track this down funnel, you're going to see some paradigm shifts in the way that organizations think around this. You'll also notice as we go through here, I have, it's a smaller number, but I do have a number against organic. Organic, I think, is often seen as not paid and therefore free, but there are expenses to the business, whether that is SEO or if you're calculating in tech deficit as far as the expense of building, running, managing the website, those types of things. You do want to have a baseline spend there, even if it's a little sort of guesswork-y, because it's not free, and you don't want to have that be free. And with a zero, you're not going to get a good ROI calculation anyway, because 0 divided by whatever is 0. All right. So as we move from thinking about, further down funnel, how many deals came out of this? So we start to look at the cost per deal. And I see a lot of organizations looking at, let's say, the cost per deal on LinkedIn and saying, God, this cost us almost $800. This is too expensive. We can't keep doing this. We should pull that back. Or Facebook is nearly $4,000 per deal. Is this a good way to be spending our money? And if you're looking at CPL or CPA, I think that those types of earlier stage evolution conversations can lead organizations to think about the cost rather than return. And it is important to be thinking about investment, but there's going to be kind of a give and take here that we need to think about. So as we start to move from spend, leads, cost per lead, and we start to shift this down into both cost per deal and also, in this case, we're just calculating this out based on an average deal size of 50K. Not just cost per deal, but with the total deal, what does the estimated revenue look like? And I think part of the challenge for some organizations is this isn't a set of numbers you can get the week after you run a webinar, because you have to give the lead time to convert down to become an opportunity. And depending on the length of your sales cycle and the general velocity of your leads, how quickly you MQL them, those types of things, we could be talking about a 3, 6, 9, 18-month journey, right? So the ability to calculate down on this does require some data to level set and then work backward on, obviously. And you have to be a little bit patient, but I think level setting that we're not going to find out how well particular tactics succeeded the week after we've run it is really an important conversation to have with leadership, because I don't think they always necessarily have that mindset when it comes to what we're spending on marketing and how that's going to impact the business really, 3, 6, 9 months out from now. What's really interesting is when we start to shift from what the estimated revenue is into actual marketing touched revenue. So it may turn out that certain channels actually provide deals that close at a much larger size for the deal than the average, or what you've estimated your average is at. And this is where ROI really starts to come into play. So it's not just leads, it's not just deals, it's actual revenue that was promoted by this. You may start to find that some channels that have a really low cost per lead just don't drive revenue, or they drive really small deal sizes. We may also find that some of those that we probably would have cut because we thought they were just too expensive for a deal size or a lead actually bring in a much larger deal size overall, or a larger client. And so that's the area where I think really starting to go down funnel and think about this and level setting why ROI is important for your organization is helpful. Now, obviously, when we look at this, typically organic SEO, because the cost is not as high, depending on what factors you're putting in here for total cost of that particular subchannel. It's going to be a high return, but I think that other components here also, and obviously these numbers are play numbers. We're kind of living in a dream world with these numbers a little bit, but I think that, looking at this, and this is just a single campaign, right? So this webinar that we ran last month about survey results with potential down funnel, impact and what that would look like. If I were looking at this and I was starting to make decisions about what levers to pull, I would be thinking about increasing the spend that I have on LinkedIn. I'd probably reduce a little bit of the spend that I have on Facebook. It frankly did drive a deal. It's not a horrible channel, but the cost per deal was high and the revenue was below our average deal size. That's not a super, great aspect here. Twitter, a little bit better than Facebook, not much, not surprising considering that these would be metrics that we'd be looking at for a B2B. AdWords, I think this is where I'd start to toy with, am I at max spend for this? Can I increase this a little bit more and maintain, that 49 to 1 ROI, dream ROI? Or as I increase my spend here, is the ROI going to drop? And I think there's kind of a threshold between ROI dropping off and the numbers going down and increased revenue. And that's a line that you'll have to walk and test and kind of stick your toe on either side of to figure out where that's comfortable for your business. And then obviously, we've got some additional numbers here. So the clear winner is organic SEO. But other than continuing to promote organic SEO listings within the SERP, there isn't a whole lot of additional push that you can necessarily make there. It's not like you can increase, a CPL by just, spending more automatically. It doesn't necessarily work that way. So that may be maxed out, but it's great to know that your SEO tactics are working. If they're not, then that's another conversation that you can surface that needs to be had by the organization. Now, if you're looking at these types of metrics pulled in on the campaign, that means that you're also able, in addition to thinking about the brand as a total, your channels and your sub-channels, to look at ROI from a tactic perspective. I think it's really important to pivot in this way and to think about ROI from both perspectives, because the reality is at the end of the day that some channels or sub-channels may work better for some tactics than others. So if you can pivot your tactic against your channel or sub-channel and start to understand what drives the best leads through those tactics, that'll help you start to optimize what your spend could and should look like as you're promoting a webinar, a new white paper, what have you. All right, so let's talk about auditing Marketo and your CRM data. If you don't have all of the pieces in all of the right places coming together to create this formula, ultimately you're either not going to have any ROI data or your ROI data is going to be flawed. So it's really important to make sure that you've level set and you have a good baseline for how you're collecting data, parsing that, and processing it through to surface it to either reporting that you're doing with CRM data that you've pulled into a BI tool potentially, and or that you're using an attribution partner for, whether that's one that reports directly within CRM or one that has its own interface external to that. All right. So obviously, we always want to start with the Marketo program. This really is the entry point for the best, way to ensure alignment. We always want to be choosing programs with the right channels and the right statuses and setting the right successes around those. It's important also to think about the relationship with your down funnel attribution on acquisition versus marketing success. And I think this can get a little interesting in some tools because they require a success or a response, as Salesforce would put it, in order to be included in certain attribution models. But when we think about registered for a webinar, that is a potential acquisition point for a new inbound lead, but it's not typically considered a success in the world of Marketo. So you want to make sure that the two of those things jive, both from the way that you're looking at reporting inside of Marketo and then also the way that that information is passed down funnel into your other reporting tools. From there, we always want to make sure that we're syncing to the Salesforce campaign wherever that integration exists. And we want to make sure that we're syncing immediately. So in this case, we're creating the campaign. It's going to have the identical statuses over there. You may choose to then disconnect and use the Smart Campaign level sync to the SFDC campaign object and status. That's up to you and your preference, and also what kind of API load your system is carrying. I know that there can be challenges with the program level sync being deprioritized, but it's also going to pass over 200 individuals in a single API call versus a one-to-one API call for any flow steps. So just some things to think about there. The other thing that is really key here is that just about every single attribution tool that exists lives off of the SFDC campaign member object. There are some that are starting to plug into Marketo. They're limited. And the reality of this interaction is, depending on the robustness of the attribution tool you're using, it may or may not be able to control the actual engagement date and time that's registering on the campaign member inside of Salesforce. What this means for us is when the person is added to Marketo into the program and then synced over to the SFDC campaign, the moment that that hits the campaign, that is going to be time date stamp for the engagement occurring. Now, if you have a sync delay and something doesn't make it over for several hours, several days, several weeks, if you have a list upload for an event, although I know these are less and less frequent, but where there were, let's say, booth visitors or in-person interactions, and the list you're uploading is based on a set of engagements that actually occurred a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks prior, your modeling and when things are time date stamped versus when, let's say, an opportunity is created could potentially be off and need correction. There are a number of attribution tools that can do that correction. Salesforce as a native functionality cannot do it. It's actually not even available inside the tool. So things to think about. It's an unfortunate component of the Salesforce campaign, something I think that's been on request for about 12 years at least. So go and upload it if that's something that you would like to see. But some things to be aware of as you're getting into this. I always like to try to also encourage people to enter program costs, even if it's zero in here. Marketo does really rely on that program cost. And depending on how your systems are integrated, some Marketo instances do actually push the Marketo program cost over to the actual cost for the SFDC campaign. So you could have parity there if you wanted it. Depending on how you're doing your reporting, sometimes it makes sense to have parity, sometimes it doesn't. So something to think about. It's also good to be familiar, if you're not super familiar with it, it's been a while since you've looked at it, how acquisition program is set. In addition to setting that data point value, it's also going to change that number for new names acquired to have that acquisition program data value set. So it's important to think about just in terms of data that you have that's correct and accessible inside the system. So when you think about reporting on these items, making sure that you have those costs in there, and also that you're maintaining the statuses and those successes and the acquisitions. This is going to break out just an initial sort of cost assessment for you really quickly and easily using a program performance report inside of Marketo. So if you have those components here, you should be able to see kind of what your CPA, CPL was. I know we don't want to use that necessarily for making larger scale budget decisions, but it can be good for understanding what's at least driving at volume and then making certain guesses about how that will impact down funnel and using that to then benchmark as you get actual data back where your gut is and what those adjustments that you probably want to make to how you're thinking about what's going to drive business really fall. So moving from Marketo into CRM and thinking about how attribution layers on top of that integration, there's a couple things here to think about. First is the CRM campaign member and the engagement date in the SFDC campaign. We talked about that a little bit. Again, some attribution tools can modify it. Salesforce just natively cannot. Some dependencies also include contact roles in the opportunity. So for any opportunity-based attribution, that's going to be an imperative component. Obviously, you have to have revenue reported inside of CRM in order to get an ROI calculation. And then you're also going to have to figure out campaign cost and spend. And this can be the trickiest one for organizations because Salesforce really isn't set up to house this at a channel, sub-channel level. It's just, this is what this campaign costs, and that doesn't necessarily jive with the way that we need to think about the world. For future proofing, if you don't have an attribution tool and you're not correcting those dates, obviously ensuring that you're getting people into those systems as quickly as possible after the engagement is key. And also keeping a log of when certain campaigns maybe were, had membership added versus when the engagement actually occurred. I think that's useful just for understanding the data that you have, but also for future state if someone does actually get, a lean data or a visible or another tool that has that capability to change that engagement date, that they have that backlog to be able to understand what would then need to be corrected for potential historic data if they're going back that far. So let's tackle probably the most difficult of the bunch first, spend. Where the heck do you put it? So there's a couple of different methodologies. First and foremost, I've seen people put just the total sum of all spend onto the SFDC campaign into that actual campaign cost, or think it over from Marketo. It is a consolidated, value. It's easily maintainable because it's just a single field. It's tactic-based though, so there's not granularity. You're not showing how much you spent on this particular webinar on LinkedIn versus another. And so that may be a challenge if you're trying to use this particular field in later reporting to pivot against that. I've also seen some people who create this like hierarchy of different fields on the campaign object. So this is our spend for LinkedIn. This is our da-da-da. It is pivotable. You can do some additional analysis. I find it a little hacky. And it's also not great for tracking spend outside of the actual tactic campaigns. So when you're trying to talk about maybe just brand promotion that wasn't aligned with a webinar or white paper or whatever Marketo channel that you're tracking against, you may not have a place to put that, or you have to create a separate campaign to put that in, and then you're trying to track against it. It can be a little funky. It's not great. I've seen a lot of brands that maintain spreadsheets that have the channel, the sub-channel, the campaign, all that kind of stuff, and then they're able to pull that into the BI tool, pivot it against the other data that they have, and get at ROI that way, because obviously you're not going to be able to calculate your ROI without the spend. It does require a lot of work to maintain. You've got to have someone in there on a, at minimum monthly, but realistically, depending on the reporting you're trying to look at, weekly basis and to update things. And it requires a BI tool, and it's disconnected from what you have in Salesforce. So that can be a little bit tricky. I personally think it's better than option 2, and frankly, probably option 1, but it's also not perfect. I have also seen processes where people do 1 and 3, and then they use that to understand revenue impact from a tactic perspective using that actual campaign cost, and then also to look at things in a BI tool from a channel, sub-channel, or campaign perspective in that way. The final one is to leverage some sort of attribution tool that automates the summation of spend. So this would be something that is plugging into any open API where it can pull spend from, and then parsing that in. There's usually still some additional manual work that has to go in against this, whether it's entering spend for how much it costs to attend a trade show, particular channels that don't have an API connection and or have one but are very guarded with who they allow to connect to it. Maybe your vendor doesn't have that access. So there's still some aspects there that can be stumbling blocks. But it does give you a full view of all engagement revenue and spend in one place, which is really nice. A lot of those don't pull it back down into Salesforce, so you do have to do it within the tool itself, but it's still a consolidated place to have that. Of course, this requires additional tech budget, and then you also have to have management for that tech, which is always an interesting thing to consider. A lot of people I've seen, they love, hate these tools because they do feel like they're a little bit black box. They maybe can't fully dig into why things are a certain way or the granularity that they want to from a certain lens that they're looking at. And again, we've talked about like if the advertiser or partner does not allow an API connection, doesn't have one, or they don't have it as a process in the business, that might not be there. All right, so next, SFDC campaigns. So you want to make sure that the SFDC campaign type is an exact match to your Marketo channels. If you're pushing in a Marketo channel, it will create that value just on that particular record for the type, but it's not going to be in the pick list, and that's going to cause problems later. So you want to make sure that those are aligned. And if you're adding to Marketo, then you also need to modify that pick list value on the SFDC side. I'm going to consistently be adding members and with the right statuses. And if you are pushing UTMs from Marketo to the campaign member, you also may want to think about what the structure and timing of that looks like. So I'm sure most of us are familiar with UTMs. Marketo has a native functionality that allows you to just grab them on hidden fields on a form if someone's coming to that particular page where the form lives, with the UTMs in their entry parameter. There are also ways that you can persist those across multiple pages so that they don't necessarily have to be in the actual URL when they get to the final page where they're filling out the form, and also can be persisted across multiple visits. If you want to capture a group of original UTMs or first view UTMs, and then a second group of current, or I usually use temp fields because I'm always nulling them afterward, you can do that. There is a way to also then pull those across into Salesforce if you want to. So several different ways of parsing UTM data for attribution reporting and surfacing them onto the campaign member. So the one on the left is using Apex Trigger to pull that information over out of Marketo. It is dependent on the person having a matched SFDC campaign name to the Marketo program. So if you don't have parity across the two systems for naming, this is probably not going to work super, super well for you without doing some additional fancy footwork about, let's say, ID numbers that you create that as a field inside of Marketo and then also have it correspond or something like that. It could be done, just not as clean. The second is a webhook. And this actually bypasses the Marketo Salesforce API altogether and inserts the campaign member with each of the values for your UTMs and any other values that we're passing across. So I've seen things like unique webinar URL logins that are passed over and other components that can be useful for that. Anything you want to get on the campaign member can be parsed this way. And I think it's valuable for reporting as well if you're limited to the BI tools, et cetera. Being able to do campaign member reporting can be very powerful in Salesforce because it is a lead contact agnostic person object essentially inside of Salesforce. So you're not having to pull a report on the lead and then a separate report on the contact object. You can just pull a campaign member object and go from there. So depending on what you're trying to report on and the order of engagements, this can be pretty powerful. Okay, let's talk about the Salesforce opportunity. I always want to make sure that the amount field or whatever field that I'm seeing on an opportunity or that I can pull in reporting is actually the same field and or the same value that the org, the CFO are using for revenue reporting. If it doesn't match, if it's an estimated number, a best guess, a initial pass at how much the salesperson thinks the opportunity is worth, and that's never corrected or updated, then this becomes invalid data, and I'm going to have to go somewhere else and or work with my sales ops team to make sure that what we're reporting on from a marketing perspective as revenue actually matches what the business is doing. If it's not, then the whole dang opera falls apart and the reporting is invalidated. So this is going to be key in making sure that your organization is set up for success on being able to report on ROI. All right, contact roles on the opportunity. So a lot of systems require that there be a contact role or person with a contact role on an opportunity in order to connect the dots between that person, their marketing touches, and the revenue. Not all attribution tools function this way. Many are moving away from it because they recognize that there are several pitfalls with this. First and foremost, I have yet to see an organization that actually religiously uses contact roles and adds everybody that they need to into the opportunity. Second, the connector between opportunities and campaign members or campaigns is very limited. So without an attribution tool marrying those together, you're maybe going to get a single touch, and even that is just based on a salesperson going and creating records off of the campaign, which you want them to be, creating them differently probably anyway. So just some things to think about. If the tool that you're using for attribution ROI calculation does require contact roles, that's a larger organizational discussion you need to have, and maybe also something to ask future vendors if you're considering getting a tool like this, what that looks like and what that means, because that may not be something you can deliver on organizationally, and it might ultimately end up being the make or break for you on whether or not you can do ROI reporting. I'll be sharing this deck out afterwards, so don't feel like you have to get through all of these, but some questions to think about auditing for your attribution setup just based on these. Looking at your program and campaign members, are they flowing through correctly? Are they syncing on time? Do the statuses match? Does all of that aligned? What's the window of time between engagement and inclusion in models? So is this matching? Are your spend numbers correct? Are your revenue and pipeline numbers correct? Do they match what's actually happening in the real world on SOWs, contracts, and what have you? Okay, so we're going to talk about auditing your attribution tool, but we're also going to talk about just attribution tools in general to start with, and then kind of drill down from there. So first and foremost, I think most of us have seen this landscape in its increasing complexity and sort of mind-bogglingness. The little country that exists currently around analytics, attribution, et cetera, continues to get more complex and robust every year. Currently, inside of G2, this is kind of the overall landscape for what tools exist that claim to be attribution. Whether or not they actually fit the bill is perhaps another conversation, but the top layer here are really the ones that have been identified, at least according to G2, as being leaders as of spring of this year. And I've interacted with many, if not most of these, and I can attest to the fact that they are definitely on the right track in being able to connect data and systems and surface information. I think the challenge comes with making that information actionable within the organization and how you actually process and parse that. So there are two types of attribution platforms. One is a CRM campaign focused platform, and the other one is cookie plus campaign. And really the difference between the two of these is that one is a data synthesizer and the other is a data creator plus a data synthesizer. And what I mean by that is those that are CRM campaign focused draw almost or all of their information out of the campaign member object. That's why the engagement date when they're added to that campaign is so important. But it also means that they're really only creating an attribution model based on lead creation forward. So everything that happens prior to the person becoming known, all of that anonymous discovery behavior is left out of the equation because this doesn't have the capability to see it or factor it in into what's happening with engagement versus revenue. This is a great place to start. It's really helpful for people that are very tactic focused. I think these can provide a lot of knowledge and information, but they're also leaving out essentially the first half, if you will, of the conversation and where a large portion of the spend happens. So with those that have a cookie plus campaign component, they're putting either a third party and or first and third party cookie on your website and essentially looking to mine information about people that are visiting your website that eventually fill out a form and convert. The challenge there, of course, is that what you're seeing in GA isn't ever going to fully match here because it's only looking at people that actually ever fill out a form. So that anonymous behavior is not necessarily surfaced unless they become known, but they have to essentially be known from a digital perspective in order to get down to opportunity, one would hope. You do have a couple gaps there. So if somebody is, let's say, being entered into the database by a salesperson and they've been on your website, but they never filled out a form, you're not going to see them there. So just a couple things to think about. It's really important to ask yourself and your organization if you're ready for an attribution platform. It's not something that I recommend just like diving in and buying just because you think it's cool. It is cool, but it may or may not actually suit the needs of your business. That said, there are basic CRM campaign synthesizers that start in the $2,000 to $3,000 a year range. So you can probably afford it, but still conversations worth having. For the more robust end of the type of reporting that you can get to, if you are using one of the larger scale tools and you're pulling in UTMs and then you're pulling that into a BI tool like a Tableau, is essentially what we're looking at here is the output of the type of reporting that we can get from that. So being able to look at things overall for the total year and then drill down by medium and source and what that total kind of came out to as far as attribution amounts, opportunities influenced, total op size, and also looking at that from a campaign perspective or pivoting this with tactic and then medium. There's a lot of different ways that you can slice and dice this data, but this is the ultimate output of having the base that we've talked about and then layering attribution on top of it and also pulling in a BI tool. Most attribution platforms out there today are not going to deliver this type of reporting without a BI tool. They have the data, but you often have to also get the data lake option in order to fully get at it, to be able to pivot it this way and what have you, which is unfortunate. It may evolve over the next few years, but kind of where the lay of the land is right now. So when you're auditing your attribution tool, the first place you want to start is, do the revenue numbers match? And if they don't, why? Some tools require there to be a marketing touch on a person associated with an account that has an opportunity to even then show the revenue. So they're only going to show a percentage or a portion of the total revenue versus what the org is going to report. If that's how that works and you expect that, that's fine. Then it means it's working correctly, but you want to make sure you understand how the tool is working before you sign off on this is actual revenue numbers related just to those that have had marketing engagement. So this is our percentage of revenue that we influenced or created or whatever the model is we're looking at aligns here. Is spend accurate? Are the touch points falling in the correct order? This goes back to that engagement date. If we're thinking about weighted or AI models, if the data is old that you're building that model on top of and you've changed the business or your ICP, that may not actually be right for you anymore. And then I think one of the key things too is, are you using an account-based and or opportunity-based model? Account-based models do not require contact role, opportunity-based ones do. And depending on how your sales force is structured, how many contacts you have on an account, if you're selling into different parts of the same business and they're all on one entity inside of Salesforce, one or the other may work or not work for you. So things to think about. All right, so getting ready to wrap up here. Key takeaways, obviously without spend, engagement, and revenue, you will never have ROI. Some data is better than nothing, so start with what you have. Work with what you can get and then improve from there. Figure out where your gaps are and build a roadmap for how to get the data you need to report on the KPIs that you're being asked to present by the business. If you don't know what questions you need to be answering, you don't know what data you need in order to answer them. And then, always evolve and mature. Even people who are doing very robust attribution reporting, I think, are always looking for ways to improve. And so don't get complacent with your reporting. Just continue at an ongoing evolution for the business, and be prepared for certain things that you have maybe set as canon to be called into question, and your marketing revenue reporting Bible may change over time. All right, questions? Feel free to take yourself off mute, throw whatever at me. I'm going to go ahead and take us off record. And